A little later on, Tim Edworthy is going to have a look at these verses in terms of what they might be saying to us today. But for now, I want us to dig a little bit deeper into the text in the context that it was written and in which its first readers, its first hearers, would have heard it. And at the beginning of chapter 3, we rejoin the story as harvesting has come to an end. Now maybe this means that the supply of food that Naomi and Ruth were getting from Boaz's fields through Ruth's gleanings and through Boaz's generosity has come to an end. Maybe it means that their immediate security has been sorted out. They have enough food, but Naomi now wants to turn to their longer term security. And this of course means, in the society they were, having a man by their side. But either way, she hatches a plan. And that plan has Ruth at its centre. And once again, Ruth is keen to do what is good for her mother-in-law. If you remember, over the last 2 chapters, we saw how Naomi had gone to the land of Moab. She'd gone with her husband, but she'd come back a widow, and with a widowed daughter-in-law, Ruth, as well. And Ruth had pledged her lifelong loyalty to Naomi in this new land. She'd given up the family, any family that she had back in Moab. She'd given up her gods. She'd given up her homeland. We saw last week in chapter 2 how in gleaning in the fields she'd given up her dignity and quite probably, reading between the lines, in so doing suffered sexual harassment and racial abuse. And now in chapter 3, in order to fit in with Naomi's plan, she's prepared to give up one of the few things that she has left, her reputation. No wonder Boaz talks about the great Hesed, another word that we looked at last week. He talks about the selfless love, the Chesed, that Ruth has shown towards Naomi, her mother-in-law. And now we need to talk about sex. Those are words that I never expected to be saying in a church service. But we need to be talking about sex because that's the way that the teller of Ruth's story sets us up. In terms of writing the story, of building up the suspense, in terms of keeping us on tenterhooks, sex underlies pretty well everything in this chapter. And in building up the story, the writer keeps us in suspense. We're never quite sure about anything. What are Naomi's intentions? What are Ruth's intentions? What about Ruth and Boaz? Do they? Don't they? We're just kept guessing. But sex is very much at the forefront. So I want to try and have us listen to the story as it would have struck the first people who heard the story. And it begins with Naomi telling Ruth to wash, to anoint herself with oil, and to put on her best clothes. This could be a sign of a widow coming out of mourning, but the impression that it's most likely to give to hearers is that Naomi is telling Ruth to doll herself up, to make herself look as attractive as possible for the mission in hand. And secondly, Naomi says to go down to, or for Ruth to go down to the threshing floor at the end of the day as night is drawing in. The threshing floor was outside of town. It was a place where men worked hard during the day, but as often happened in such circumstances, they worked hard, they drank hard, they often played hard, and anything could happen. This was the place to which Ruth was being sent. Now, Boaz, being an honourable man, his threshing floor might be different to others. But certainly that's the association that people would have made in their minds. And we ought to add as well, with our 21st century hats on, we might well say to Naomi, what on earth are you thinking about? Sending a woman like Ruth into such a situation where she is vulnerable both because of her gender and because of her race. Thirdly, Naomi tells Ruth to wait until Boaz has eaten and has drunk. And we're told in the story that he did indeed eat and drink and was in good spirits. And that phrase probably conveys pretty much what you think it will convey. It's meant to suggest to us being slightly under the influence of alcohol, slightly tipsy. It could just be that he's eaten and he's drunk, and on top of a hard day's work, that's enough just to make him ready to drift off. But the inference is that he's slightly the worse for wear and ready to be taken advantage of. And fourthly, Naomi says, when you see where he is sleeping, go and uncover his feet. And we might say, well, what does that mean? Uncover the feet. It seems a strange phrase, and indeed it is. And most commentators would say it's a euphemism. It really means something like uncover the legs, and when you uncover the legs, you also uncover what is at either end of the legs. Need I say more? And there's two other aspects that would have struck the original hearers and pushed them in this direction. One is the continued reference to the fact that Ruth is a Moabite woman. And generally speaking, foreign women, Moabites and any other foreign woman in the Old Testament is usually only referred to when they're talking about them as sexual temptresses, wanting to tempt away good Israelite men. And in the first week we saw how the origins of the Moabite people, as described in the Old Testament, began in sexual deviancy between Lot and his daughters. This was the reputation that was carried, or that Moabite women carried among Israelite men. And you can begin to see with those prejudices as how people might, as the story develops, be beginning to think, is this Moabite woman going to resort to type? And finally, in chapter 4, we have Ruth's story tied to the stories of two of her ancestors, or at least two of the ancestors from her family tree, to Tamar and to Leah. And what connects both of those women, who would have been very familiar to the hearers of this story? What connects them both is that they had plans and pushed through plans to sleep with men in the middle of the night who did not know who they were, and therefore to get what they wanted by deception. Put all of those things together, and you realise that the narrator is selling us a vision of Naomi's plan that looks something like this. In the middle of the night, crawl into Boaz's bed and seduce him. And Boaz is an honourable man. And then hopefully he will do the honourable thing and marry you. And so it begins to develop. And you get that point, that slightly humorous point, where it says that Boaz woke up in the middle of the night and was surprised, startled, to find a woman lying by his feet. But then we begin to see not sexual love, not romantic love, but a different kind of love on display, a deeper kind of love. That word chesed that we talked about earlier, that we talked about last week. That's kind of love that comes from, not from the heart, but from the mind and the will. that kind of love that really is a mirror of God's love for us, that kind of love that is focused above all on doing the right thing, that kind of love that is concentrated more on the needs of the other person than on my needs. Chesed. To look for chesed in this story begins, as we said earlier on, with Ruth and her devotion to Naomi. The fact that Ruth is prepared to give up everything in order to make sure that Naomi is okay and has a future. But she also shows great chesed towards Boaz as well. Not just as Boaz says that she's prepared to choose him over the younger and more desirable men, but also because she isn't prepared to get what she wants by deception. She is honest, she is transparent. She asks him directly if he will be her Goel, her Redeemer. She asks him to spread his cloak of protection over her, essentially to marry her. And Boaz says yes. But if you think this is opening up a great romance, think again, because Boaz too is exhibiting chesed. He's exhibiting a selfless kind of love that is more concerned for what is best for Ruth than for his own interests. Why do I say that? Because at one and the same time he is prepared to marry Ruth. He's prepared to take a possible stain on his reputation that will come through defying the Old Testament law and marrying a Moabite woman. But he's also prepared not to marry Ruth. Did you notice that in the story? He says that there is someone closer to him, a closer relative. And if that relative is prepared to marry Ruth and for Ruth to find a security that way, then that is okay too. Stay here for the night. And in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good. Let him redeem you. But if he's not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Both Boaz and Ruth display chesed love. That love that mirrors the love of God for us.
I've been to church regularly since before I was born. And that means I've sat through my fair share of children's talks as I was growing up. One of the earliest and most repeated of those that I remember is about a boy who made a model boat. He spent hours on making it, and eagerly he took it down to the sea to play with it, only to see it swept away. He was devastated. Imagine his surprise then when, a short time later, he saw his boat for sale in a shop window. He went in and pleaded with the shop owner, "That's my boat." The shop owner wouldn't give it back. He had bought it from someone else after all. But the boy loved the boat he had made so much that he bought it back. He made it. He lost it. He bought it back. And God made you. He lost you. He bought you back. That was the message of that children's talk, which you may well have heard before. And in Jesus, he has made it possible to use the more technical language for you to be redeemed. And the thought of being redeemed is central to Ruth chapter 3. Let's recap for a moment. In chapter 1, we find Elimelech, Naomi and their family leaving Bethlehem at a time of famine in search of a better life. In Moab, sadly, Elimelech dies, and his two sons marry local women. 10 years on, also very sadly, the sons die, and the three women are all left as widows. Naomi decides to return to her own people, giving her two daughters-in-law the option to stay behind among their own people. Orpah does so, but Ruth follows Naomi to Bethlehem. In chapter 2, we find Naomi and Ruth apparently in need of the local food bank. This is to be found in the fields, gleaning for ears of corn overlooked by those harvesting. Ruth finds favour with Boaz, a relative, as it turns out, of her late father-in-law. And through the harvests of barley and wheat she gleans, and it seems that she gets to know Boaz much better. Now, in chapter 3, we find Naomi hatching a plan to find a home for her loyal daughter-in-law Ruth. So Ruth is to wash and perfume herself and put on her best clothes, just as a bride would do for a new husband. Then to go and lie at the feet of Boaz, a close family relative, through her marriage. Ruth does so, with Boaz sleeping deeply, full of food and drink after a day's threshing of the barley crop out in the fields. As instructed by Naomi, she uncovers his feet and lies down. Suddenly, and surprised, and probably suffering from cold feet, Boaz wakes up. "Who are you?" he says through the deep darkness. She replies, "I'm your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you're a kinsman redeemer of our family." Boldly, her proposal of marriage is made. Now, if this were a question of sport, we might be asking, what happened next? As Steve has outlined, the language used here is full of ambiguity. Has Naomi manipulated Ruth? Is Ruth complying willingly? Does Boaz take advantage of her through the rest of the night? From all that we know so far of Ruth and Boaz, it seems that she is a decent woman and he is an honourable man. There seems no doubt that Naomi sees an opportunity, but it seems likely that Ruth and Boaz did not jump the gun, so to speak, in terms of their possible nuptials. Instead, they wait for the resolution of Boaz's role as a kinsman redeemer. Now, last week, Steve outlined some scriptures relating to the kinsman or guardian redeemer in the Old Testament. I'll probably repeat a little of that, but I want to say that fundamentally, the Hebrew concept of goel, that we translate as kinsman redeemer, is a relative who acts for another person in the family circle at a time of crisis. So the goel is one who redeems property. You can read more about that in Leviticus 25. When a person becomes poor and has to sell property, the nearest relative is to redeem what has been sold. And Naomi appears to be in need, and she is selling land that was her husband's. I'm trying not to spoil the plot for John, who's preaching on Ruth 4 next week. But the land will be bought by a relative. If you read Leviticus 25, you'll find that this is God's provision to ensure that land stays with the people of God. It's a reminder that it is really his land and not theirs. Who owns your land, your home? It might be you, it might be a relative or a landlord, but really it belongs to God. Graciously, he allows you to have it. It might be your possession, but if you are his possession, redeemed by him, how might you use your home, what you possess, for his glory? Boaz discreetly provided food for Ruth as she was gleaning his land. And I think this book of Ruth causes us to ask how we offer hospitality to those we know and those we don't, through that with which the Lord has blessed us. We also find that the girl is one who redeems people. If a person becomes poor and has to sell himself to a rich foreigner living among the people, a relative may redeem them. Might that have been facing Naomi before she returned from Moab, and now facing Ruth as a foreigner in Bethlehem, perhaps selling themselves into slavery? And yet, as the story develops, we find that Ruth is redeemed by her close relative. How might we follow the example of the kinsman redeemer here? We have a family, don't we? And it is ultimately the whole human race. We can't personally redeem all, but we can help some. The past week has brought the powerful example of Marcus Rashford onto the front pages of the papers. As a Manchester United and England footballer, he's more used to being on the back pages. But during the lockdown, he's been active in Manchester working for the Fair Share food charity, as they've raised £20 million or so to feed children who, if they were at school, would be getting free school meals. Well, that was mostly under the radar. But then, as we know, this 22-year-old has used his profile to speak out and force the government to back down over plans not to extend free school meals for school children into the summer holidays. He knows from personal experience in a one-parent family how important free school meals were to him and his siblings. And without this U-turn of the government that has been brought about, those children might have become even more enslaved to poverty. It is a truly impressive and moving example from an impressive young man. Here's a challenge to you and to me. Ask God, how can I make a difference right now and bring hope to some? Even just to one. That'll make a difference. And let's see where God leads. So the girl is one who redeems property and people, but neither of these things actually require a kinsman redeemer to marry Ruth. No, that comes from Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 to 10, where we find that if a woman's husband is to die without leaving a son, it's the brother-in-law's responsibility to marry her and father a child for the dead man, that his name may not be blotted out from Israel. In Ruth's time, this responsibility seems to be extended to close family members also. Plot spoiler alert, but I think you know anyway. Ruth will get married, and there will be a son who will be grandfather of King David and an ancestor to Jesus, the son of David and the Son of God. And that takes us to Jesus. You see, for us, there is a Redeemer. And in many ways, Boaz becomes an Old Testament type for Jesus. See, Jesus is related to us by blood, a human being who made himself nothing. Found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. And only his blood could pay for our blood guilt. And Jesus is able to pay the price by his precious blood, a lamb without blemish or defect, as 1 Peter chapter 1 tells us. And Jesus is willing to redeem us. For, as Matthew 20:28 says, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. You may not have had to sell property to make ends meet, or yourself. But I wonder if there are things in life that you have sold out to. Things to which you're enslaved. Things from which you would like and you need to be free. Jesus is willing to redeem you, to set you free. Ask him and seek the power of his Spirit to lead you into freedom. Finally, 3 more things. There was a closer kinsman redeemer than Boaz who would have done for Ruth. For us, only Jesus will do. It was Ruth's initiative under Naomi's guidance that she lie down at the feet of a kinsman redeemer. It is God's initiative in Jesus Christ that we can meet him at the foot of the cross. And thirdly, through Jesus, our kinsman redeemer, God, who loves us more than we can know, says, I made you. I lost you. I bought you back.